Welcome to the Mies Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Sharkey, the founder and CEO of Mies, the culinary operating system for food professionals. On the show, I'll be interviewing world-class entrepreneurs in the food space that are shifting the paradigm of how we innovate and operate in our industry. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Yo, they say art mirrors life with every stroke of the pencil. I'm giving you folks a glimpse into my experiences you could trace like a stencil.
My guest today is Lior Lev Sakars. Lior is the chef, spice blender, and owner of La Boite, a biscuit and spice shop in New York City. He hails from Israel, where, of course, he was a sergeant in the army. He also grew up in a kibbutz, and then he headed off to France to attend the Institut Paul Bocuse before working for some incredible chefs like Olivier Roulanger, who was one of his mentors, and then traveling to the States to work for Daniel Boulud, which was his last stop before deciding to pursue his calling in life, diving deep into the world of spices. Lior's approach to creating spice blends is as close to a work of art as I think you'll find. He has an uncanny ability to meld not just flavors and colors and aromas, but also textures and mouthfeel to create these unique and timeless spice blends that, well, chefs go crazy for. He's collaborated with a ton of incredible chefs like Eric Appert, Laurent Tournadel, and plenty more. He's a best-selling cookbook author with 3 books and a 4th on the way, and if that's not enough, he's working on one of the most innovative approaches to a culinary academy that I've ever heard of in his home country of Israel. We're going to talk about that, along with his past, the product lines at La Boite, and generally just Lior's outlook on the spice industry at large. I hope you enjoy. This podcast is brought to you by Mies, the culinary operating system for food professionals. As a chef and restaurant owner for the past 20 years, I was frustrated that the only technology that we had in the kitchen was financial or inventory software. Those are important, but they don't address the actual process of cooking, training, collaboration, and consistent execution. So I decided if it didn't exist, I'd do my best to get it built, so the current and next generation of culinary pros have a digital tool dedicated to their craft. If you're a chef, mixologist, operator, or generally if you manage recipes intended for professional kitchens, Mies is built just for you. Organize, share, prep, and scale your recipes like never before, and get laser-accurate food cost and nutrition analysis faster than you could imagine. Learn more at www.getmies.com. Lior, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me.
Very, very excited to have you on, man.
I'm excited to be here. Looking forward to it.
Why I was so excited to have you on is, one, I think you probably can agree, there's a lot more sort of spice purveyors coming about now that have really great product and are sourcing well. But I don't think I've met anyone that, in addition to being an incredible sort of purveyor of spices and someone who knows so much about the spice world, you are, and I know this sounds silly or cliche, but you're like most definitely an artist when it comes to the craft of spices. You're not just sort of buying and sourcing them. You manipulate them and you use your inspirations of people and places and history to create these blends. And I also love that you have this sort of element of texture to the blends that you create. Not everything is the same ground. Some things are a little coarser and finer. And I'm really interested to hear how you got into not just the world of spices, but the way in which you go about creating all of these blends. I know your background as a chef, but maybe if you could just, for the audience, just let us know like how you got into this, why you approach spices the way you do.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, it's been a long journey. It's definitely not over, which gets me excited. I don't think it will ever end, this quest of flavor and taste. As you mentioned, yes, there are a few players on the market today that weren't around 5-6 years ago, even 10 years ago. To some extent, it's our fault of raising awareness for spices. And then I think other people seeing an opportunity. Listen, it's great. I think that as long as there's great awareness, I'm happy to have other people playing in the market. It makes our job a bit more complex, keeping our game the highest level. I think that one thing that always did and will continue to set us apart at La Boite is we're a food company. We think food, we think flavor, we think creativity. Our way to express it is via spices and other pantry items. We are not a spice company in terms of buying and selling. So my 30 and something years as a chef play a huge role in the people who work at La Boite. We're just really geeks when it comes to food and ingredients. That's kind of the thing that drives us. So it's a quick background. I'm from Israel, from a small kibbutz in the Galilee. I guess always had a passion for ingredients. Like, before foraging was a thing, we just went and picked berries and went fishing in the river next to the kibbutz, and whatever was in season, that's what we ate. Now it's cool. Back then, it was just being a child and riding your bike to do things before the whole Scandinavian movement made foraging into a thing. Traveled quite a bit with my parents to Europe, and I think that also was a big part of my curiosity of ingredient. Israel back then, the food scene was not very exciting. Now it is probably one of the most exciting food scenes in the world, but in the 70s it wasn't. So traveling in Europe, being exposed to different proteins and produce and cooking technique really kind of added another layer. And then fast forward military service. And after that, I decided to kind of get involved in cooking on a professional level at first with no experience, then culinary school in France, and then moving to New York, and then opening La Boîte 16 years ago. As a result of seeing the sad status, if you will, of the spice cabinets or racks in restaurants or at people's home, and taking upon ourselves this mission of conveying the message that spices are an ingredient, they're not an afterthought. And the same way that you take the time to buy great produce and protein, you should do the same when it comes to spices. Now, the challenge was, and still is to some extent, is where do you get good spices? Because what's available around you isn't necessarily the case. So I've spent the last 16 years and still am to date in terms of traveling or traveling online, finding the best sources, purveyors, brokers, importers. There's a whole supply chain from the farmer to us, and establishing just really trustworthy relationships where I know that our broker isn't even going to try to sell us something that they know we're not going to like, even if they're losing some money. And so it's upsetting to some extent, but it makes me happy that there's buffers. It's hard to get to the level of the farmer in most cases, or to the single origin, single sourcing, knowing that a lot of these farmers grow very little. They don't always have the means to connect directly with you. They're not set up for export or import. So we're very open about where we get things and where we get them from. We strive to get the best possible and do the right thing with our partners around the world and make sure that they get paid on time, the right price. At the same time, we have to be conscious of sustainability, of being able to get product all the time. So there's that plays too, and a lot more of regulation that every year just become more and more complicated.
What are some of the biggest challenges you've had in recent years with sourcing really good spices?
Couple of things. First of all, obviously COVID that just delayed everything in terms of speed of getting things and unloading boats with material. We haven't seen any shortage or outage of something dramatic, let's put it that way. And luckily, climate change has not affected the quality that much. We have seen just lower production in areas like Japan for Sancho, where crops were just smaller this year. It's a bit upsetting because it's a product that we love, but at the same time, it puts us in perspective and our partners that we work with, explaining to them that seasonality is still a factor in our lives. The same way that you cannot buy rams in September, Sancho has a season, there's X amount of it, and it's okay. I think it's wrong that you can buy strawberries outside of the season, but that's market demand. So I think in the spice world, some things are still very hyper seasonal. There's still some climate change that affected vanilla a few years ago. There are political issues. And as an example, mustard seeds, which seems like the most obvious thing. I mean, you go to the store, you want to buy mustard. We've had, I wouldn't say a crisis, but a pretty bad situation in the last year and a half or so, where Canada, which is the biggest producer in the world of mustard seeds and really great quality, had a drought of sorts, so lower crops. COVID happened too. And then, well, you'd say, well, there's probably a backup option to Canada. Where else can we get mustard from? And the second biggest producer happens to be Ukraine. So I don't need to explain myself. So it goes to the point where finding whole grain mustard at the supermarket becomes challenging. Prices are 3 times as much as they were a year and a half or 2 years ago. So those are all small things that impact our day-to-day life, not to mention packaging and trucking delays. But overall, I think that I'm glad we're over this COVID era and restaurants are back up and running and people are cooking. I think that if there is a positive impact to the last 2 years is that people learn how to cook or learn how to use their kitchen, use spices. There's more interest. And I think that that was quite a good learning curve for a lot of people to really connect with cooking.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talked about sourcing produce and things like that, and we think about that. Yeah, and in the restaurants, we're maniacal about like what farm did this kale come from, and do we know the farmer that raised this pig, and what did the pig eat? And I don't remember ever having conversations about that, about the spices that we're buying. What do you see as some of the most common like misconceptions about spices that we use in the restaurant? You come from the restaurant world, you see the giant tubs of black peppercorns we get and cumin and all those things. I don't think we think twice about where did that come from and who sourced it. What are some of those like most common things that you see as like misconceptions?
I think it goes back to education. I think as cooks, we all start somewhere. We start in a restaurant, we have a chef, or we go to culinary school. And I'm fighting really hard to change curriculum in culinary schools. And we can talk about my project later on of building the culinary school in Israel. As a young cook, the idea of seasoning is not taught anywhere. This gesture, this selecting the product. And like you said, I walk every week or every couple of days into a kitchen without naming any names, whether it's fine dining or fast casual or whatnot. And you do see these gigantic tubs of peppercorn and paprika and cumin, and just visually you can tell that the product is bad or not good. It's faded, it's powdered, it falls apart. And I often have these chats with our partners like, what is wrong with you? I mean, don't you care? And it's hard because for some reason, which I don't necessarily have the answer, you would spend lots of money on protein and produce and your wine cellar, but then fundamental stuff that you season your food with, for some reason, people are like, well, I could kind of compromise here. I can cut corners. I think it's also lack of knowledge. I think that once you see or taste good pepper or cumin or paprika, and I'm just talking about the basic everyday things, then you understand. As an example, I got to cook with a bunch of Israeli friends not that long ago. And so it was their first time in the US. And there's like, what is wrong with your salt here? I was like, what do you mean? It's like, it's not salty. It has no flavor. And it's true that when you compare, and I like kosher salt. Do I use it? No. It's not salty.
What's your go-to salt?
One of my favorite is actually gray salt, which doesn't get enough good PR. I love gray salt, unrefined, high iodine, smells like the ocean, great texture, not expensive even. It's super affordable, just great stuff. I use obviously some fine sea salt and some fleur de sel and Malden, of course, but on a day-to-day, it's pretty much fine sea salt and gray salt, but really good ones. So either Pacific sea salt or French sea salt with higher salinity content to it. And we see success. It's a long battle-ish with our partners, just trying to convert them, trying them to use right vocabulary, not saying I want black pepper, is getting into more specific or what varietal. So it's nice when we see now emails coming in with orders and somebody will order Telicherry black pepper and Muntok white or Penja white or Malabar or Sarawak. And so the same that you will order a Wagyu or an A5 or a grass-fed, where you don't just call your purveyors like, I need a steak. They're like, I need more than that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I feel like there's such a noticeable difference, too, in terms of how much you need. When you have like really good aniseeds or ajwan or cumin, you need much less than you would. Then there's recipes where if you use the amount of cumin, for example, in a recipe of like really good, like high quality cumin, it would be way too powerful. And I think that there's also like this conception of probably like they're saving money by buying the spices from the brand we won't name. And they're not.
We see it all the time. It's like exactly what you're saying. People are like, oh, but you're 30% more expensive. Sure, yes, we are for a variety of reasons. We get great product, we pay the farmers or the suppliers, and the product itself is just better quality. And like you just said, you'll need less of it. And we hear it all the time from people, especially if we do blending services for them, which we do a lot more and more. We take their formula, we don't even touch it. We just use our spices, we send it back to them. It's like, oh my God, I now need to use 20, 30, 40% less because it's so pungent and strong.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, you're paying the same price. And I think that other partners of ours see the benefit and are charging slightly more. We have a great relationship with the falafel shop in Philadelphia, where, their average ticket is probably $8, $9 for a falafel sandwich and a soda or something. And their portion of their French fries now on like spice wise is probably $1.50, but they just decided to up the price and sales of French fries are up 40, 50%. Customers are coming back for fries and they want that great flavors. The fine dining equivalent would be, do you want the pasta with the added $30 of shaved truffle, or do you just want the pasta? So I think that there's great opportunities and you don't need a lot, like you just said, to make any.
Yeah. I want to talk about your blending process too, because I think part of that quality and freshness is also the texture, right? Because I've chewed on cumin seeds that I bought from Le Bois. Like, you can eat them like whole, and you can't do that with an old sort of like generic cumin seed. And what I love about your blends is there's always like a little bit of texture to them. And I think it seems like it's a part of your process, but I'd love to learn, like, what is your process of when you're creating like new blends, whether it's like for a chef or just in general for the company? Like, how do you go about thinking about the blend, and how do you actually like test it? Are you using just like really plain mediums like yogurt and bread, or are you doing different techniques when you're testing blends? I'd love to hear a little bit more about like the process.
I eat spices all day long, especially if we get a new batch, a new delivery. I'll put some kind of chew on it or kind of grind it and taste it. I want to evaluate the quality, make sure that what we're getting. So that's part one. It's really evaluating the raw material as it comes. If I'm creating blends for, let's say, myself, like my initial ideas, there's an idea, a concept, something that I'm excited to. But if I'm working with another chef or another professional, I want to hear their thoughts. I mean, where do they want to go with it? What's the flavor and scent profile? Is a specific dish that they're actually looking to use this for? And they're just great to work with. They're really excited to see the result. And I will make a blend. We have a little test kitchen here at Spice Lab. We, like you said, will either put some on yogurt, olive oil, some bread, but even cook a piece of meat, a fish, a vegetable before we send it to that chef or that professional to make sure that it actually works. And then I let them play and get their feedback. Glad to say that for the most part, it's getting to the point where there's less and less adjustment or none at all, or they're very minor. I think that really listening from the beginning to their needs and what they're trying to achieve. And I know most of them over time and, what works and what doesn't and what they like and what they don't. So that's really helpful. And as I said earlier, the fact that myself, my culinary director, and other members here come from the culinary world, we can see the application right away on how it's going to work in a kitchen. We don't need to imagine and guess. And I think with time and a lot of people that you and I know in common, once you get better or good at this thing called cooking, a lot of it is done in your head. I mean, you could start imagining these combinations and if they're going to work and if they're not going to work. I think that's really beautiful when you can get to that level.
I want to definitely dig into like how you collaborate with the chefs, but even just the blends that you guys create that everybody can use. I was looking last night. I think there's over 384 recipes in Mies from chefs that just use the Concale, the Fleur de Sel blend.
Yeah.
I mean, that one's amazing. The Salvador is also obviously like used a ton. The Salvador number 9 and the Isaac. Anybody who hasn't used these blends as a chef, I would definitely check them out. The Isaac is incredible. I love the Salvador as well. You're clearly like creating blends that can be used in multiple ways, and I want to dig into how chefs learn about Le Boit and how they can learn more. But who are some of the chefs that you've collaborated with on sort of custom blends with?
Having worked with Daniel Boulud for so many years, so that was and still is an amazing partnership, and Daniel being a real mentor and always kind of a point of contact for any advice, question. So that was the first and most obvious relationship. We spoke earlier about Marc Forgione. Marc was one of our first customers. I met Marc through Laurent Tourondel in the BLT era. And so both Laurent and Marc were kind of the first to kind of jump on board and say, we have a meat purveyor, we have a produce company, we'd like for you to be our spice company, which I think was one of the best things that ever happened to us, is coming from these two great chefs saying, we could do everything in-house if we wanted to, but we don't. We just want to buy it from the best possible sources and focus on cooking. And then later on, we have a very long, amazing partnership with Eric Ripert at Le Bernardin and some other places around the country. Gavin Kaysen from Minneapolis, we both worked for Daniel, and it's doing incredible thing in Minneapolis. And in Florida, we have Michelle Bernstein, and on the West Coast. So the list goes on, and hopefully, I forgot like another 300 or so partners, and then the cocktail angle of it, and pastry chef and beer brewers and distillers. So the list goes on and on. It's really humbling and great when we get an email from somebody saying, I worked at this and this restaurant. I was a line cook. I was a sous chef. I'm now opening my own thing, or I'm going to work for somebody else and would love to bring you on board, or somebody recommended it. So, which is obviously the best compliment.
Yeah, I imagine that's a big part of how you've grown in the chef community. That's what I've seen for sure, is all of these chefs like, I worked at Jean Georges, I worked at Daniel, I worked here, and I worked for Forgione. And they may not be able to have their own custom spice blend with Le Boit, but they're using the blends. How would a chef go about saying, Lior, can I create a custom blend with you? How does that work?
For the most part, those are existing partners. It's rare that somebody will just come with a non-existing account. It does happen, and we're happy to do it. It's slightly harder because I just don't know them that well. But whether it's that or an existing partner, it's just picking up the phone, sending an email saying, hey, can we do a custom blend? And the answer is yes. It might take a minute because there's a long list of projects in the making, plus our regular 400 and so blends that we already make. So often enough, I'll start with like, hey, have you tried one of these that we already have that they just didn't know that existed? So that's sometimes that. But if they still want to pursue it, we'll make it. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month, depending on how fast they can go, and depending on my schedule too, because I want to make sure I clear enough time to work on that blend properly.
What are like the most common blends that chefs are using sort of across the board? I'm sure that they're using a ton of them, but are there any that sort of like rise to the top as the most common ones?
The one that we already make, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, so you mentioned some of our best sellers ever. Concal, I don't think we even have any stock of it. We make it, it's gone. We make it, it's gone. Our pepper blend, the Pierre Poivre, which is same thing. So those are the two big ones. The smoked salt, definitely high on the list. Isaac, that you mentioned. Our Shabazi spice, like the Zhug powder.
Oh, yeah.
Tremendous amount. For years, I didn't want to do a shawarma spice just because I didn't think I owned that space. and I didn't really know what it meant. But then a great story, a dear friend of mine said, can you not only make me one shawarma, but make me two? One that's more kind of on a North African approach, and then one that's more Turkish. Without thinking, I made a shawarma West and shawarma East, and it's insane. The amounts of that we now in the last 2 years sell of those two, not to mention Za'atar, which it's by the pallet. Baharat.
What style of Za'atar do you produce?
We make something that's closer to between a Lebanese Syrian. So it's pretty fine ground aside from the sesame, obviously. So there's no big chunk, high sumac content, great Za'atar leaves in there. We also sell Za'atar leaves themselves, which is a fun ingredient. Part of the big change is Middle Eastern cooking becoming more and more popular. Mediterranean, the whole Israeli movement. where you see these products now featured even in French, Italian, or any other restaurants, which I love the fact that there's not the fusion movement, but the infusion is how can you bring flavors from something else into your different type of cuisine, if you will.
I'm actually just gonna use you as an encyclopedia, but I noticed there isn't a quote unquote Ras Al Hanout blend at Le Bois, although you have the Tangier, which is similar to that. But I always thought that Ras Al Hanout just basically meant the same thing as masala, it's just a blend of spices from the spice shop. Is there actually a defined this is what Ras Al Hanout is supposed to be?
Not really. I mean, most people will agree that there's things like cinnamon and some clove and maybe some black pepper, some cardamom, but aside from that, you're on your own, in terms of what you want to put. You'll find in some traditional ones some kubeb berries, which is quite interesting because they come from Indonesia, but that has to do with the trade and the whole aspect of back in the day. But aside from that, everybody has their garam masala or their tandoori and so on and so forth. I love tradition and I love the respect of tradition, but I think it's up to us to write also our own kind of tradition. So you can twist and make whatever you want.
I don't think I've seen anything, but have you ever played around with anything from the Mexican cultures? And you sort of these Oaxacan spice blends used for moles and things like that?
So we are working on a mole for a client at the moment using sesame seeds, which could be found in parts of Mexico, this idea of sesame seeds in mole.
Yeah.
We're not there yet. I mean, we still have a couple of tweaks to do. I think that's probably the only kind of Mexican-oriented blend that we currently do. We do work a lot with Mexican oregano and, obviously a bunch of chilies and things like that. But for now, this is kind of the only. I tried miserably to make a tajin just because people were excited to try that. But I still need to perfect that.
Any spices at the moment that you're super excited about?
Always kind of going back to the classic cumin, cardamom, cinnamon. That's a couple of chilies that work with that. The za'atar leaves in the last couple of years, so also using that quite a bit. And Urfa chili, which, I could just not get enough of it. It's just so addictive and so good.
You seem to really love Urfa. Why do you love the Urfa chili so much?
So I kind of took a break from peppercorns for a minute and try to educate myself more about chilies, and the different ones, and we carry a certain amount. To me, Urfa is a combination of, it's not just the heat. The heat is definitely there, but it's that chocolate, cocoa, wine notes. It's so complex, everything just in one item. I go to phases where I'll just cook only with Urfa and then move on to the next thing. Yeah, so I'm still on that Urfa phase for now.
I love it as well. I want to make sure we talk about the culinary school, but before we get to that, we talked in the beginning about why you started doing this. Obviously, you work for some incredible chefs, and after working with Daniel Boulud, you decided, okay, America doesn't have any sort of good spice options, and so you started this. But how do you think about the future of the spice market in America? Do you think it does seem like it's getting more embraced now, but it's still pretty minimal? The world of the brand not to be named lemon pepper and chili powder and things like that are ubiquitous in America. Do you see that going away anytime soon?
No, I don't think so. I think there's a place for a good lemon pepper. And it's hard for me to even say that, but for a pumpkin spice, listen, as long as you're using spices, I'm happy. I think that obviously I would like for people to make the right choice. I can tell you from what I see happening in our world, even the larger companies are stepping up their game in terms of packaging, messaging, sourcing. There was very little competition, if at all. And the consumer is becoming smarter and more knowledgeable. People travel, people eat in ethnic restaurants. They now know the difference. Even in the barbecue industry where, you're like, why does it matter? Because it goes into a smoker. It does matter, and people are starting to make the change and the difference. So I think that's not going away, and that's great. But at the same time, you want to call it the craft spice industry is becoming bigger. You see better spice aisles in large supermarkets. You see more interesting ingredients. So I think we're heading in a very, very good direction.
Obviously, you're far more well versed than I am on this, but I would assume that the majority of our spices are imported. Do you see like America starting to produce better spices domestically?
As now a proud American citizen and having lived here for 21 years, I'm all about domestic farming. I love our partners in different countries, but I think we could do more. There's land, there's potential. We, as an example, only buy domestic sesame. I think it's fantastic. We try to buy as much garlic, onion, things that are available. There's either not enough of it or we're just competing with the large scale manufacturers. But I'm always excited when somebody points me out to a grower here in the US. It's great. So I hope there would be more. I hope this culture of growing spices, drying spices will get bigger.
You know, I was in Austin for a food event a while back, and I didn't realize that these lime leaves grow everywhere. And, you know, people pick them off and they're using in restaurants, but clearly there's enough sort of different types of climates in America where we could have more spices grown here. What do you think needs to happen? Are you working on anything, you know, with any sort of farmers or anything to try to bolster production in America?
We're not working directly with anybody. I mean, every once in a while I'll meet somebody. I think the biggest challenge is not so much the growing of it, it's the processing, which requires space for drying, dehydrating, grinding. And so I always try to have a constructive conversation with this farmer saying you have surplus of growth. Instead of hurrying to the market right away, think about growing something that's going to be dried right away or freeze dried or whatever. And then the shelf life is so much longer. The challenge is that the price is often tricky and not that exciting for the farmer to spend time on it and the time to process and the space that they need. So I'm hoping that more and more people will see the reasoning behind it, the financial benefits of doing that. I don't think we'll ever be able to be 100% domestic. It's just climate-wise, it's very challenging. But we are working on, I mean, you did ask about, we're working with a vanilla company that if all goes well within 2 to maybe 3 years, you'll be able to set up your own greenhouse and grow vanilla start to finish from the growing to the curing with an automated, semi-automated system that's AI based and will allow better control and better quality and flavor. They're currently aging via something that I don't even understand half of it, how they do it. They're aging vanilla beans for our specific profile, which we should get in about a month or two.
Sort of like what Smallhold is doing with mushrooms. I mean, people can literally like grow and cure their own vanilla beans?
Yeah, they analyze a lot of vanilla and like what are the components, and by developing a technology of drying a combination of heat and time and air, they're able to age vanilla to different profile to enhance the vanillin inside to be 10 times higher or even more, but also develop profiles that are a bit more smoky, savory. I went to visit their facility in Israel. It's pretty amazing what they do there. And they're looking into developing these kits where you can grow your own vanilla.
That is so cool, man. You mentioned Israel, so I'm just going to jump into the culinary school. Can you talk a little about what you're working on there?
We're building a place called Galilee Culinary Institute, or GCI for short, set to open May of 2024. I went to school in France. My parents were very unhappy that I wanted to become a cook to begin with, but they also were unhappy that I left the country and basically never came back. And since that day, I think in 1997, I was always thinking about how can we bring culinary education to Israel. Things have changed quite a bit. There's a handful of now smaller or slightly bigger culinary schools in Israel, some devoted just to cooking, some for baking, some for both, a couple of high schools. But as I was working on it for over 20 years and was trying to find a partner to fund this, which I have, and they're called Jewish National Fund. They're amazing in their support and building it. The idea was to really challenge the education as a concept. I mean, is college too long? Are you learning the relevant things that you actually need once you graduate? What's the rate of success in the real market? And so we've spent 4 or 5 years thinking of that, came up with the concept of GCI, which is a campus that includes a restaurant, a wine bar, a coffee shop, a beer brewery, a chocolate lab, auditoriums, classes. It's open to students from all over the world, as well as visitors, of course. So aside from being a student, you'll be able to come in, dine, eat, hang out, drink. You can take a 1-hour class, a 1-week class, but our flagship program is a 12-month program in English. Again, open to students from all over the world, no background needed, no prior experience. Just have to go to a series of interviews and really spending 12 months exploring cooking, baking, cheese making, wine making, distilling, knife making, and so on and so forth, just to give you a better idea of where you want to go with it once you graduate, with tools in management and basic legal work and all of that, so that you are better prepared, whether you're going to go to work at a restaurant, open your own, whether you're going to work in a lab for a food manufacturer, be a food stylist, a food writer. We want to kind of work with our students to understand where they want to go with it. And the fact that you like to make an egg doesn't mean that you need to become a cook. Maybe you're just an amazing writer or a creative, and you could go into that direction.
Like you said, it's not just going to be for learning how to cook, but for all these adjacent parts of the food world, which clearly you're doing one of those things. But how are you going about teaching those things? If it's journalism or e-commerce or something, are you just creating separate classes just for that, or are you just giving sort of like a foundation that they can go learn more?
We're working with great partners on curriculum. And so we're utilizing their sets of skills on how to write curriculum. But for them, it's a super exciting thing because they come from traditional culinary education where you're evaluated on your knife skills and your French classic mother sauces. And I said, don't get me wrong, I like knife skills, but let's first go and visit a knife maker and talk about carbon steel and handles and all of that. And so there's not about really failing or getting an A+ or a B-. It's, did you understand what a knife is? And potentially you decide to become a knife maker. And one of your other classmates will become a farmer. So we're trying to expose students to as much as we can with an hour course, a 10-hour course, depending on what it is. How do you do cupping? How do you taste coffee? If you were to open a restaurant, coffee is a big part of it. Do you even know how to evaluate that? So it's utilizing a lot of professionals from around the world and Israel in their fields. I think one of the funniest examples is our AC company that is designing our AC systems. And so I engaged the head designer of that firm to come and teach a 2-hour course about ventilation and AC. Now, often it's like, I came here to cook. Just give me a steak and a knife and some pepper. I want to cook. And I would argue saying you could be the best cook in the planet. If your AC system is down in your restaurant, good luck to you, my friend, running a service. So when you do call that maintenance company, or are there things that you could do on your own, to me, it's as valuable as knowing how to cook a steak properly to a medium rare.
Oh my God, I wish I had culinary school like that, and not being sold 30 tons of AC when you really only need 7, and over engineering that way. Man, that's such a cool approach to culinary school. I also feel a little of the influence of the kibbutz in there, and you can kind of do whatever works best for you. So I feel like that a little bit of that influence from your childhood is showing up there.
Listen, I told the curriculum team, listen, if you want to put in a 3-hour fly fishing class, I'm all for it. We are fortunate enough to build this in the Galilee. There's Druze communities, Christian, Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, Eastern Europeans. I mean, all within a mile away from each other. You could see caviar production, winemaking, distilling, cheese making. There's a food science center right there with an amazing lab. That's really the part. Not to mention that we have a 6-acre farm just for the school where students could really work with their peers of saying, okay, our next menu at the restaurant is going to be something. Let's just grow that for the next menu. Or let's bring everything back and compost it and put it back into the ground.
Man, I can't wait to come check this out. I'm the only one in my family that has not been to Israel.
We're going to fix it.
I'm definitely making it there for that. That is so exciting, man. I had no idea the way you're going about it. But so you said 2024?
May 2024, yes.
How do people in the States learn more about that?
We have a website, obviously, called GalileeCulinaryInstitute.com.
Okay, cool. We'll put that in the show notes for sure.
GalileeCulinaryInstitute.com. Go there. There's a ton of information. You can just contact one of our team members. You could start a pre-application for the program, sign up for a monthly newsletter, and just simply, just email me. Just send me an email, lior@laboiteny.com for any questions, coaching, life support, or just to chit chat. I think that going back to the COVID
All right.
days, which reinforce our communities as cooks and culinarians, and the support that we can lend each other. We all go through the same thing, whether you're a restaurant owner, a spice company owner, or a wine importer. I think we need to talk more to each other as a group, as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of life support, I was going to ask you, because I think you have kids too, right?
Yeah.
My kids, at least my son, barely eats anything. Do spices help them open up to more food?
I call it the chef's curse. I have two amazing kids that are very savvy New Yorkers, even though they're only 7 and 9, but they know everything about everything. The youngest will eat pretty much everything, from mussels to lamb, fish, and everything in between. However, the child will not eat a piece of strawberry or blueberry, which seems very interesting to me. The older one, at the same time, the flip side, will only eat fruits, vegetables, and yogurt and would not touch a piece of meat or fish or even pasta. So it's something that I'm fascinated. If I had more time, I think I would devote myself to kids' food and understanding why is it that they like or don't like something. I'm really fascinated about this.
We actually have a food therapist right now working with our son. And my son loves to cook with me, and we make all kinds of fresh pasta and all kinds of things together. But he literally will eat. There's 4 things. He'll only eat the very, very high quality feta. It won't eat the crumb. It has to be like the block with the really nice brine sheep's milk feta and nuts and seeds, and that's basically it. Maybe some bread.
Wow.
I think the texture thing.
Yeah, I think, one of them is very sensitive to smell, which is challenging, but makes me happy at the same time. As somebody that's my profession. But there's hope. I married a vegetarian who now eats only meat pretty much. So I think it's a matter of time. I think stress definitely doesn't help. I think that I am more relaxed about it now. I was more stressing as a young father. Obviously, nobody gives you a handbook of the do's and don'ts. The one thing I would say is just one day at a time. What was valid yesterday isn't valid tomorrow. And then I just ask them what they want to eat, and that's what they get to eat.
Yeah, I think exposure is probably the best
Yeah.
thing. Just keep exposing them to it, and eventually they get it. We'll move away from kids
Yeah.
now. I wanted to talk for a minute about Pierre Poivre and Olivier Rollinger, because
Yep.
it seems like they had a really big influence on you. So I'm always curious, like, who were people's mentors, and those two had a big influence on you. I'd love to hear, like, why, and are you still in contact, or
Yeah, of course.
even maybe work with?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little more of that.
So I was in culinary school in 97 to 99 in France, and part of school is requiring you to do a stage, an internship or externship. And so I did my first one in the south of France, near Spain, in the Catalan area. And then for my last year in school, I applied to Les Maisons de Bricourt, which is a restaurant in a small town called Cancale, thus the name of the blend I made later on. I got a very nice letter saying thank you, but no thank you. But for some reason decided to send a second letter. And somehow to this date, I don't even know what made the change. I got a letter from Olivier's wife, Jane, saying we would be happy to make an exception. We never take any stagiaires. Just show up April, whatever, 1999, etc. So I show up to this beautiful little town on the coast of Brittany near Saint-Malo, near the Mont Saint-Michel, back then 2 Michelin star restaurant. I think I was there at 1:30 in the afternoon, went up, put my stuff, and by 4:30 I was in the kitchen, started to cook. I knew what Olivier Rollinger, who was the head chef, a fascinating life story of a person that nearly died in a very brutal attack by some just gangsters in his hometown of Saint-Malo, and decided to quit his engineering studies to become a cook and a chef. And within 2 years got a Michelin star, and then a 2, and then really became a world-renowned chef and influence, and I see it when I travel and I eat at a restaurant. You say the word Roulanger and people are like, oh my God, that's the reason I cook, or that really impacted my life. Less known in the US, obviously in Europe more. In the US, it's more, high-end chefs that we know. It's unfortunate because I think a lot of people could read his book, watch his movies, and understand he's a great philosopher. So I ended up in that kitchen, and I thought I knew something about food and something about spices, and I was proven wrong in the very best possible way. I encountered spices that I never even heard of. I saw how somebody cooks French cuisine in Brittany with some of the finest fish and seafood on the planet, with spices from Indonesia and Madagascar and India, and really became fascinated with the notion of spices. And Olivier, being the great mentor that he is for me and for others, was very smart in terms of having me do my own journey and research about taste and flavor, and not just dictating this is what it tastes like. Where to this date have a great friendship with him, his wife, his son, who took over part of the business, his daughter. They built a really beautiful business in Concal and around it. Are we competitors to some extent? Kind of. He has a really beautiful spice business. The handshake agreement was, you stay in the US, I'll stay in France, let's not bother each other. They do buy a couple of products from us, which is always great. I admire what they do, and it's always great. I owe him a tremendous amount. The reason that La Boîte exists, just the name alone came from him, of La Boîte. That was his idea.
Wait a second. I have somewhat poor French, but I'm pretty sure it just means the box, right?
Yeah, so as I was leaving Daniel, and Olivier got his 3 Michelin star. I happened to be in England for a wedding, and I was like, if I'm already here, I'm going to jump on a quick, cheap flight to Saint-Malo, 35 minutes, not even, maybe 40, rented a car, made reservation to eat at Le Maison de Bricourt, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. They only have the other restaurant, which is fantastic. But went there, got there at 6:45, dropped my bags at a bed and breakfast, and went to eat there. And the next day, met Olivier for coffee. And so him being a very fatherly figure is like, so my son, what's your plan? I was like, I'm leaving Daniel. And he was like, to do what? I was like, I have this idea of doing cookies first, because that was the first company. I'm going to make these cookies, and there's going to be some art and some spices. And he was like, all right, just go do it. And by the way, if it was me, I would call it La Boîte à Biscuits, which just means the cookie box, which sounds obvious, but it's a perfect name. And so I went home and I started La Boîte à Biscuits. And then when the spice business came around, I call it La Boîte à Épices. And then at some point, I just got rid of the rest of it, and we just narrowed it into La Boîte. It makes sense, box in French, boîte in French, aside from being an actual box, it's a structure, it's a company, it goes beyond. I also happen to collect boxes on a side kind of gig. I took some time off from that because I have no more room to store them. I have over 2,000 different boxes dating anywhere from 1900. But yeah, that's kind of how the name came about. And so when I started the spice business, as a result of Marc Forgione and Laurent Tourandel, out of their requests of like me blending spices for them. So one of the first blend was Concal, and that was kind of my tribute and homage to Olivier and Concal. And then Laurent wanted a pepper blend for steak. I can't remember. It's like, okay, let's pick a couple of blends together. I was looking for a name. I love naming blends. It's something that I'm really excited about, giving them a name. And I was doing some reading, and I stumbled upon this personality named Pierre Poivre, which means Peter Pepper. Fascinating story. Little did I know that he was from Lyon, and I probably passed next to his tombstone 1,000 times because it's in the center of Lyon in a church. And that's kind of how the name came about. And, 16 years later, it's the most sold blend that we make. I semi-jokingly said that I hope it's going to be on my tombstone, the creator of Pierre Poivre. It is now a trademark, or at least in the process of being registered. And that's Pierre Poivre. I met somebody the other day who said that that's the only pepper they use for many years now, which is an amazing compliment.
It is an incredible pepper blend. I'm not sure if Pierre Poivre would be happy or sad about this, but if you search Pierre Poivre on Google, he does come up as the first result, but then every other result is from LeBoit. So you've taken over his name.
We reached out. We're trying to do the research for the trademark. We can try to connect with the society. There's like a non-for-profit. We want to make sure that we're not offending anybody. And I hope we're making him proud, of being the rebel of the spice industry and really somebody that I admire. So hopefully every time somebody uses a little bit Pierre Poivre, it makes him happy.
Yeah, absolutely. And you started talking about his background, but I also think it's pretty fascinating how he was able to sort of bring spices to so many places where they didn't exist. And he worked for the French East India Company, right?
He was a religious person sent on semi-religious, semi-economic reasons by the French government back in the day to spread the word of God, but also kind of maintain the books and develop relationships. And we're talking about an era where spices were a reason to start a war. Think about Manhattan, that part of the Amsterdam Treaty. We live on one of the most expensive pieces of real estate on the planet, probably, was traded for clove and nutmeg, I'd like to buy an apartment here with a couple of cloves and nutmeg. I don't think it's no longer an option.
Not right now, at least. That's awesome, man. I love that story. I had no idea about where LeBoit came from either. So thanks for sharing that, man. We're wrapping up here. I wanted to sort of just ask you if there's anything that you would like to tell the audience. Like I said, it's probably the majority of them chefs, restaurant owners, mixologists, just food professionals. Anything that you'd like to share?
I really would like to invite everybody who's listening to it and is involved in food in one way or another, just rethink spices. They deserve more attention. They deserve to be highlighted. You're doing justice to the growers and the vendors and this industry, which is fascinating. So the same amount of time, attention, and money that you're spending on anything else should be dedicated to spices. It takes you to a third dimension. I think it really makes a difference on what you're using. We're obviously here. We have people come here and visit us all the time. It's an open house. Come and see us and explore and just educate yourself more. Come to Israel next year. Hopefully, for May we'll be open. And also as a shameless plug-in, and you can cut it off. I mean, the next book is coming out in June. It's called A Middle Eastern Pantry. It's really my tribute to the Middle East pantry items and this whole culture of preserving, pickling, drying, and the notion of having a pantry, which for some reason doesn't exist anymore, and how you can make amazing food with these things, or how you can even make your own pantry items.
When is that book coming out?
June 13th.
Oh, very
June
cool, man.
13th.
We'll put that in the show notes as well. So what's the best way to get LeBoit spices into our restaurant?
Either send an email to info@leboitny.com, or if you're ready to go, then it's just orders@leboitny.com. One of the team members will set you up, open an account, send you samples, and talk to somebody. We have a couple of people here, including myself, who can walk chefs through the process of what to get, how much to get. As I said again, it's not like dial 1 for this, dial 7 for that. There's actual people that will pick up the phone and or respond to the email and provide advice and consultation, if you will, in terms of what's the best possible things to get. And you can always reach me. It's just Lior@LeboitNY.
All right. Lior, this was awesome, man. Thank you so much for taking some time. I know you got a busy day.
And make sure you use Mies. That's the most important.
Do you have recipes? Put them in Mies. Thank you for the plug.
Yeah, put them in Mies. It's all about the recipe.
All right, man.
All right.
Thanks for tuning into the Mies podcast. The music from the show is a remix of the song Art Mirror by an old friend, hip-hop artist, Fresh Daily. For show notes and more, visit getmees.com/podcast. That's GETMEEZ.com/podcast. If you enjoyed the show, I'd love it if you can share it with your fellow entrepreneurs and culinary pros, and give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. Keep innovating, don't settle, make today a little better than yesterday, and remember, it's impossible for us to learn what we think we already know. See you next time.